about African Americans during World War II. The increase in war production provided good jobs for African Americans. Around 2 million African Americans worked in aircraft factories, steel mills, and shipyards, while the others were in the war. By 1945, more than 1.2 million African Americans would be serving in uniform on the home front. Tuskegee Airmen. The Tuskegee Airmen left their families to go to war. The Tuskegee Airmen were African American fighter pilots who trained at Tuskegee, Alabama. By the end of the war, they had destroyed or damaged about 400 enemy aircraft. They had formed the 332nd Fighter Group and the 477th Bombardment Group of the U.S. Army Air Force. African Americans had to fight for the right to serve as pilots in the U.S. military because the Army Air Corps was adamant that blacks could not serve as combat pilots. However, due to a presidential decree in 1941, the Air Corps began training a limited number of pilots at Tuskegee, Alabama. During wartime, jobs opened up for African Americans. Pullman began hiring African American production workers at its railcar factory in Chicago in the late 1930s and increased in number there substantially during World War II when it produced for the military. While many were in the war fighting, it opened up a new life for African Americans on the home front.
Hi, I'm Olivia Slater. This is an amazing time in history. February 7, 1942, segregation and discrimination had reached its breaking point. The Double V campaign stood for two victories for African Americans, a victory at home and a victory abroad. Before this time, African Americans were treated very unfairly. I have gotten a chance to speak with Lawrence P. Scott, a black airman in the 99th and eventually Tuskegee Airman. He tells me, every man in the 99th was aware that the success of the 99th would impact the status of blacks in the Army Air Force as a whole, and that each man performed his job as if the race depended on him. This campaign was two victories for African Americans. At war's end, the campaign would serve as a reminder of why blacks black servicemen and women fought. Not only was that war to face enslaved people abroad, but was also fought for the equality of black African Americans at home who were willing to fight and die for our country. This is an amazing story to tell why the Double V campaign was such an amazing part in history. Thank you.
I am Kate. Among one of the many African Americans affected during the war, Harry Gumby, raised in Pennsylvania, was among those who had to deal with segregation, even in the midst of war. We now have footage of an interview with Gumby. So tell me a little bit about yourself.
I grew up in Mount Holly Spring, Pennsylvania. Quite a small town. My daddy was a farmer. We had a big garden and he planted vegetables and sold them. He also worked as a boiler man at a paper mill. My mama did washing and ironing. She also cleaned the library. I also had 6 brothers and sisters. We heard that Pearl Harbor had been bombed. I remember thinking, Pearl Harbor? What in the world is that? But it meant we had to go to war. And soon enough, I got drafted as well.
How old were you when you got drafted?
I was 19.
Did your parents want you to go to war?
No, they never wanted me to go to war. They said I was a white man's war and that we had no business fighting. My mother and my niece walked me to the bar, to stop and say goodbye. They load us into a train like a bunch of cattle and we were off to war.
So during the training, were you segregated?
Oh yeah, I came to camp with a white Neil, but he was raised black because part of his family. Oh, was African American. That was sometimes happened. Anyway, we walked when we arrived, and I was in a dorm with him. But when he waked up, he was gone. I asked about it, and they said, "You mean transferred? We came here together." He said, "Yeah, but you're gonna stay here, Neil." Went over to the white people. I said, "You've got to be kidding me." And he said, well, he was white, wasn't he? So are the African Americans, and the whites were separated. Even so,